Okay, hi everyone. Thanks very much for coming to my talk today. I'm Adam Smith. I'm an Honorary Research Fellow in the School of English at the University of Sheffield, and today I'm going to be talking about the prosecution of James Montgomery. Hopefully you can all see a handout, and if you're on the bus you can see an iPad as well. So I'm an Honorary Research Fellow at the School of English in the University of Sheffield, and I'm attached to a newly formed Centre for Archival Practices. My research itself is on newspapers, magazines, periodicals, print culture in the 18th and 19th centuries, with my doctoral research focusing on political print published in London during the early 1700s. And you can just imagine what an exciting time that was for me. But whilst completing my PhD, it occurred to me that all of these London papers printed in the 18th century seemed to be sort of smugly metropolitan, instinctively characterising the good, politically engaged southern citizen in contrast to a crude and frankly offensive stereotype of the north. So they'd ask rhetorical questions like, what makes a good voting citizen? And it'd respond implicitly, someone who isn't one of those northerners. And this is kind of, it was just there, implicit in all the papers I read during my PhD. So once the PhD was over, all of this led me to wonder then, what were political papers like outside of London? What were they like in the north? And this question led me to the remarkable life of and work of James Montgomery, who I'm going to talk about today. Luckily, as part of my role in the Centre for Archival Practices, I've been fortunate enough to visit and explore archives all over Yorkshire and Leeds, Yorkshire, in Leeds, York, here in Sheffield. And it's largely through archival research here in Sheffield, at Sheffield Archives, and at the university's own special collections, that I've been able to piece together the story I'd like to share with you today. So, who was this guy, James Montgomery? Has anyone on the top deck of the bus heard of James Montgomery before? Very excellent. That's brilliant. Well, for those of you who, for the one of you who didn't put your hand up, James Montgomery lived 1771 to 1854, and he spent most of his life here on these streets in Sheffield. In the last biography to be written on him in 1929, Reverend Odom, an honorary canon of Sheffield, concluded that James Montgomery, quote, coming in his early years to Sheffield as a stranger, became one of its most esteemed, influential and beloved citizens. Montgomery's long life saw him edit the Sheffield Iris newspaper and become the nation's most prolific writer of hymns, as well as being a respected poet and a prolific man of letters. He went on to become one of the nation's most vocal anti-slavery abolitionists, a pioneering philanthropist, and a champion of both nonconformist religion and education for all. What a guy. And if you hadn't heard of Montgomery the man, I've no doubt at all that you would have encountered him in your time at Sheffield without possibly even realising it. So if you look at your iPad for a second, here are some places you might see Montgomery every day in Sheffield. There's the Montgomery Road, upon which we find the Montgomery Hotel. There's the Montgomery Theatre, which was once the Montgomery Hall. There's the Montgomery Wesleyan Chapel in Leather Edge. Some of you may even remember or have heard about the Montgomery Tavern, later just known as the Montgomery, which opened first as a Victorian pub, converted from the actual one-time offices of the Sheffield Iris newspaper, now sadly closed and demolished. Within Cutler's Hall, that great building opposite Sheffield Cathedral, there's a bust and a full-length statue of James Montgomery. And on the east window in Sheffield Cathedral, there's an inscription to Montgomery which celebrates his name between those of Moses, David, St. Matthew and St. John. But perhaps most impressive of all, and certainly most surprising, is the dedicated information board up on the wall on the Swim-In Wetherspoons on West Street, detailing his life achievements and contributions to the city of Sheffield. With all of this in mind, how shocking it is then to turn to the 16th issue of the Sheffield Iris newspaper, printed on the 17th of October 1794, and read that its editor, the young James Montgomery, had been charged with treason, sedition and libel. He was described as a wicked, malicious, seditious and evil-disposed person when he was presented before a jury in Doncaster on the 22nd of January 1795. How this came to be, what happened next, and why this case in particular is deeply relevant to every one of us on this bus and outside in the mall today is the story I'd like to tell you in the next 15 minutes. To understand how this came to be, we need to dig a little deeper, a little further into Montgomery's past, where we find him taking his first job in journalism, working for a different, earlier paper, the Sheffield Register. In his late teens, Montgomery had successfully applied for a job as an office boy come apprentice at the Register, where he soon caught the attention of this man, the editor, Joseph Gales. And in the pages of the Sheffield Register, we find Gales to be a charismatic champion of causes and a staunch defender of liberty. Another great guy. His was a career, though, regularly dogged by charges of treason and sedition, because he was rallying against the government at times. Eventually, Gales's luck ran out, and bankrupt and wanted by the authorities on a charge of conspiracy, he was forced to flee English shores and start a new life as a fugitive in America. And this left James Montgomery without a paper and without a job. So at age 23, he actually took it upon himself to find a way to bring this paper back. He teamed up with a Unitarian minister, James Naylor. They bought Gales's shares and they took over the register. And the first thing they did was to change the name to the Sheffield Iris and insist that the new paper would not court controversy in any way. This was going to be a new beginning, a new politics. And in its first issue, this new paper claimed that the editors professed themselves desirous to avoid, in this publication, the influence of party spirit. It was going to be more neutral. In fact, so far had this new paper now apparently moved away from the radical tone and intent of its predecessor that the letters pages of the early issue see some very disgruntled and disturbed readers compelled to make their feelings known. How times change. So a particularly memorable letter, which I've reproduced on your iPad, is penned by the angry and confused Jacob Demo, whose letter appears in the third issue declaring, "Citizen printers, I am so angry at you. I am afraid you are a set of sad wretches, and that you will ruin the finest cause in the world with your low-lived notions of impartiality and moderation." Given this level of caution and the care that Montgomery was apparently taking to avoid upsetting the authorities, it's all the more surprising that within months he was charged with printing seditious material. It's more surprising still when you read the item that he was charged for printing. So the alleged libel, it didn't even appear in the Sheffield Iris. It was instead a relatively benign poem printed for a travelling vagrant named Joseph Jordan. The poem itself had already been printed once before by Gales, also for Jordan, and it was printed again so that, well, basically Joseph Jordan goes into the office, says, Montgomery's busy, and he says, I'd like to print this poem. You printed it for me before. And they say, why? And he's like, well, I sell straws in the street, and I really want to sweeten the deal. So the idea is that if someone buys a straw, I'll also give them this poem. So they're like, okay, that sounds fine. Unfortunately, the first person he gives the poem to is a constable of the law called Samuel Hall, who marches him to the local authorities and begin to charge Montgomery for allowing this to happen because they thought the poem itself was seditious and treasonous. The poem was written sometime between 1789 and 1794, and it talks about the need to restore France and protect Europe against tyranny. It makes at least one explicit reference to the Bastille, and there was one stanza in the poem particularly thought to be seditious, which I've actually reproduced on the back of your handout. So on the back of your handout, at the top of the page, is the ballad that got Montgomery into all this trouble. So then, let's finally turn to the trial itself. I hope as we do this, I've given you some sense that there was far more going on here than meets the eye, a point emphasised, I think, by how incredibly well documented this trial actually was. The Irish newspaper dedicated an entire issue to offering what it termed a preliminary account, whilst also including an advert to Montgomery's own later edition of the account to be bought separately. Then, Montgomery's first biographers, two guys called Holland and Everett, later interviewed people present at the trial, and along with Montgomery's own letters and editorials, produced a composite account as part of their Montgomery memoirs. So there's lots of people interviewed about what happened in this trial. There's lots and lots of accounts. Significantly, in all of these accounts, it's not just James Montgomery on trial, but the cause of Sheffield radicalism, and as I want to argue for the remainder of this paper, something far greater, something that remains highly relevant, especially to people like me today. So when Mr. Tucker, the prosecution lawyer, turns to the jury, he says something absolutely extraordinary. I couldn't believe it when I read this in Special Collections Archive. He's recorded saying to the jury, it was the province of the jury to decide whether the passages were libel or not. If so, the words were a gross and palpable libel because they tended to render the people discontented with His Majesty's government, with the war, and the conduct of it. So what this means is that the jury are told that it's their interpretation of the poem that will determine Montgomery's fate. If they read the poem as treasonous, he goes down. If they don't, he walks away. The trial is presented in all these accounts as being utterly dependent on an issue of interpretation, and I think an issue of literary criticism, which is what I do. And what we have in the cases presented by the prosecution, by the defence, and ultimately by the jury are a series of rival strategies of reading, rival modes of interpretation. In fact, the fundamental issue at stake here is a question of authorial intent. What did the author mean? And a question of authorial responsibility. How responsible is the author for the way people interpret what is written? Who owns interpretation of a poem? Or more significantly, particularly for us today in the age of Twitter, who is responsible and who is culpable for that interpretation? These are questions that have characterised literary criticism for the best part of the last 100 years. What is the role of the author in interpretation? How important is it to be asked what it is that the author actually meant? And for a long time, the author in criticism meant everything. In early 20th century criticism, the author was a kind of god, and we as critics were tasked with deciphering the secret meaning of their words. We decoded authorial intent. So you get questions like, what did Shakespeare actually mean by this? What can this play tell us about what Shakespeare was actually thinking? But that all changed when literary criticism decided to figuratively kill the author. The most famous manifesto for this new kind of criticism presented itself in Roland Barthes' magnificent essay that if you've not read, I recommend you just Google. If you're bored tonight, it's a life-changing essay called The Death of the Author, and it's written in 1967. And Barthes asserted that the old style of criticism, which sought to find a definitive interpretation, was ultimately stifling and reductive. Instead, Barthes argued that if we abandon the idea of a definitive interpretation, then no text is ever closed, it's never finished, we're never done with Paradise Lost. Now the reader is responsible for creating meaning, not the author. In this new formulation, the reader or the critic takes on a more creative role, collaborating with the text itself to create infinite new interpretations, using the same examples of literature to explore radically different facets of human society and experience. Suddenly, literary text could be used to work through social, psychological, or philosophical problems that might never have occurred to the original author. And it means that all of us today can produce our own interpretation into our own dialogue with these texts. However, I should stress that what I'm describing here isn't the evolution of literary criticism. It isn't a linear progression. Not all literary critics are the same. In short, to paint a picture in very, very broad brushstrokes, you end up with two competing bodies of thought. The intentionalists, what did the author mean? And the anti-intentionalists, it doesn't matter what the author means. Astonishingly, these very same arguments are seen to characterise the trial of Montgomery, and this is why I'm talking about literary criticism. Mr. Tucker, when mounting the case for the prosecution, presented to the jury what would now be termed, by people like me possibly, a hard biographical reading. First, the jury are presented with an interpretation of the poem as being unambiguously addressed to England's current conflict with France, therefore making it a treasonous libel. It's about the war with France. Remarkably, the prosecution's account is actually written up in one of these accounts of the trial, with the prosecution's interpretation appearing in brackets next to the original lines of the poem. I've put that on your handout. So the second stanza there is what the prosecution gave to the jury. So it's the lines of the poem, and then in brackets, what the prosecution thought those lines actually meant. Tucker's justification for this interpretation is based entirely on Montgomery's own biographical history. Montgomery, through his work on the Sheffield Register, that first newspaper I mentioned today, was implicated in what Tucker alleged to be an ongoing project, quote, undertaken for some time to circulate seditious publications among the people of Sheffield, intended to inflame their minds and render them dissatisfied with the government under which we live. Worse still, according to the prosecution, Montgomery was a known friend of Mr. Joseph Gales, who we met earlier, and was well acquainted with the radical principles preached in the Sheffield Register. Therefore, based on Montgomery's known associations with the cause of Sheffield radicalism and the alleged behaviour of his former friend and employer Joseph Gales, Tucker suggested to the jury that his reading of the poem was most likely, and that it was entirely fitting for a man like Montgomery to have arranged the publication and dissemination of a song with the specific intention of rousing dissent and dissatisfaction. Tucker, the intentionalist critic that he was, substantiated his interpretation entirely through biographical assertions. Everything in his prosecution is reduced to what was supposedly known about Montgomery, not as a writer, not as an editor, but as a person. Then the defence stand up. The defence then rose in the form of Mr. Vaughan, who first clarified that the prosecution's case was built more upon the character and behaviour of Joseph Gales than James Montgomery, who, let us not forget, had only been editing the Iris for 6 months at this point and was still a relatively unknown entity. Then, like any good new historicist critic, Vaughan went on to investigate the song's publication history and the context of its initial composition, using this information to provide a carefully contextualised reading of the poem itself. The poem, Vaughan argued, was written before the current war with France had even begun, a good 10 years before the current war with France, and the poem's own explicit mention to the word Bastille demonstrated that it wasn't about the war with France at the moment, but it was about the events of the French Revolution 10 years ago. Vaughan then interrogated, he did close reading, he interrogated the poem's use of the word France, complicating Tucker's assumption that the nation stands unproblematically for the monarchy, the government and all of its subjects. The France that needed liberating, Vaughan suggested, is not the nation as a whole, but the French people, subject to the tyranny of the monarchy. So there's a difference between the king and the people. They're not all the same thing. And the French people that this original poem was trying to liberate wasn't France as a nation, it was these people who were subjected to a tyranny that, if left unchecked, could present a threat to Britain. So in fact, the poem could be seen as a defence of Britain, not an attack on it. Crucially for us today, though, this was an interpretation formed through a careful reconstruction of the song, the poem's original context, and a sensitivity to its formal qualities. In this instance, the use of the word France. What does that word mean? Why is it being used? He did a close reading, a carefully contextualised close reading. The prosecution strove to present the most authoritative interpretation through assertions based on Montgomery's life and biography. The defence focused instead on the text itself, treating it as a kind of historical artefact. However, the conclusion drawn by the jury was more extraordinary still. And imagine me reading through this in the archive. I couldn't believe what I found next. So after an hour and 55 minutes, the jury returned and brought with them the verdict. James Montgomery had been found guilty. Mr. Vaughan, the defence counsellor, leapt to his feet, exclaiming that the indictment had been for a libel concerning the current war and the Majesty's conduct in that war, but he had proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that the poem itself was addressed not to the war but to the French Revolution 10 years earlier. The response that Vaughan received was once again extraordinary, as Mr. Taylor, on behalf of the jury, explained that it has been observed that the song, for which the defendant stood indicted, had been written, printed and published long before the current war began. This, however, was nothing to the purpose. It didn't matter. That which was perfectly innocent in 1789 might be grossly seditious in 1794. And though the song was no libel when it was first published, it may be a libel for all that at the time the defendant had published it again. So the jury then had accepted the defence's reading of the poem. They accepted that the poem meant something quite different when it was first composed, printed and published. And yet, regardless of how it was originally intended, when published in 1794, it could be read as a libel against the current war and when it was published again, and Montgomery, who saw it into production, could be found guilty of that intent. Crucially, if it can be read as libelous, if it can cause dissent, it is libelous. So we've seen that both the prosecution and the defence made arguments grounded in assertions that the poem's intent was in some way external to the poem itself. For Mr. Tucker, Montgomery's personal character determined the poem's intent, whilst for Mr. Vaughan, the defence, it was the poem's original context. However, regardless of what Montgomery actually meant by its publication, when read in August 1794, it did function as a treasonous libel. The cases presented seem to fluctuate between those two poles of intentionalist and anti-intentionalist criticism I glossed earlier, before remarkably determining that intent is something outside of the text that is added by something inherent in the text's own form, in its own words, something that's already there, determined not by the author or the reader, but by the text itself. For me, as an 18th century scholar, what excites me the most about this case is that it demonstrates that multiple modes of reading and interpretation were operating at the same time in a way that might be seen as far more contradictory or incompatible today. These different methods of reading were all happening at the same time. Montgomery was fined £20 and sentenced to 3 months in the Castle of York because the text he published could be read as a libel in a way that it was never intended when he first composed it, but in a way that it could be read. He became its legal guardian in print, making any new interpretations imposed on the text by other people his responsibility. In the 18th century, it seemed that the author figure could indeed be theoretically dead. A text could exist without him, but the author remained culpable and remained responsible. Of course, James Montgomery's story didn't end there. And though this and another grueling trial a couple of years later did eventually prompt him to walk away from this newspaper culture, he did continue to write, producing hundreds of hymns, poems, tracts, speeches, letters, and I can promise you that he lost none of his political edge. Through this writing, he fought for all those spectacular causes I outlined at the beginning of my paper today. And despite facing huge adversity, he did succeed in securing his place in local legend as a hero of Sheffield, a point exemplified by the giant life-size bronze statue of James Montgomery, paid for by subscription by the people of Sheffield at the cost of £1,000, which can still be found today, standing next to Sheffield Cathedral, looking out over the offices of the Sheffield Star. Thanks very much, everybody. Thanks a lot.